In the spring of 2025, President Trump made the biggest gamble of his presidency, declaring what one leader would call an economic war on his closest ally. A wave of punishing tariffs was designed to bring Canada to its knees. But Washington was expecting a quiet surrender. Instead, it got a two-front fight: a cool, strategic prime minister in the nation's capital and a fiery, defiant premier in the industrial heartland. They didn't just fight back. They found America's own pressure points and squeezed. How did a president's ultimate power play get turned back on itself, leaving the White House stunned and outmaneuvered? For generations, the US-Canada border was less a line on a map and more an assembly line, the longest in the world. This was particularly true for the auto industry, where a single vehicle's components might cross the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario, half a dozen times before it rolls off the line. This deep integration created millions of jobs and a shared prosperity that made both nations stronger. It was a relationship built on a bedrock of trust and predictability. Businesses on both sides invested billions, confident that the rules of the game would not change overnight. This seamless economic partnership wasn't just an advantage. For countless communities on both sides of the border, it was a way of life. But that was the old relationship, and as a new prime minister would soon declare, the old relationship was over. The shockwave hit on March 4th, 2025. Invoking emergency economic powers, President Trump bypassed Congress and slammed a crippling 25% tariff on most goods imported from Canada. The move was a sledgehammer, intended to force Ottawa to the table on his terms. The White House made its position clear. This was a gamble. They were confident they would win, and they reserved the right to escalate tariffs even further if Canada dared to fight back. The clock was ticking. The future of millions of jobs was suddenly hanging in the balance. For a factory owner in Michigan who relies on Canadian steel, or a home builder in New York using Canadian lumber, this wasn't just a headline. It was a sudden, overnight threat to their entire business model. The promise from Washington was that this short-term pain would lead to long-term gain for America. The reality was immediate chaos. The president had placed his bet. Now the world waited to see how Canada would respond. The first response came from the nation's capital, Ottawa. Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, a former governor of the Bank of England, was a global financial strategist. He knew he couldn't win a brute force brawl, so he chose his targets with surgical precision. Canada immediately fired back with its own 25% tariffs on tens of billions of dollars of American goods. But this wasn't random. As Carney himself declared, the strategy was to inflict maximum impact on the United States and minimum harm here in Canada. This was a cool, calculated move from the national leader. But 500 kilometers away in Toronto, a very different kind of response was brewing. Doug Ford, the populist premier of Ontario, Canada's industrial and economic engine, saw the tariffs not as a negotiation, but as a declaration of war. In a fiery press conference that sent shockwaves back to Washington, he laid out his position in the starkest possible terms. But Ford wasn't just talking about bringing jobs back. He had found a hidden weapon, a unique point of leverage that no one in Washington had seen coming. Ontario is a major energy producer, and every day it sells vast amounts of electricity across the border to power homes and businesses in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. Ford found the light switch for those states, and he threatened to flip it, announcing a new 25% surcharge on all electricity exported to the US overnight. The conflict changed. This was no longer just a national issue between Trump and Carney. Suddenly, a governor in Michigan or New York had a brand new problem. Their own citizens and businesses were now in the direct line of fire, facing the threat of soaring energy bills, all because of a trade war started in Washington. Ford had turned the tables, creating powerful new political pressure inside the United States for the White House to back down. The strategy was working. Faced with a two-front economic battle, Carney's strategic national tariffs and Ford's targeted provincial pressure, the White House began to feel the heat. When Trump's administration threatened to escalate the conflict even further with a 50% tariff on steel and aluminum, Ford made a brilliant tactical move. He temporarily suspended the electricity surcharge. This wasn't a surrender, it was a signal. It showed Washington that he could turn the pressure on and off at will, and that he was a rational actor willing to de-escalate if they were. The gamble had backfired. The president had expected to be the only one making threats. Instead, he found himself being masterfully outplayed. But in this war of economic attrition, there are no winners, only shared costs. The bill for this high-stakes conflict was being paid not by the politicians, but by ordinary people on both sides of the border. In the United States, the threat from Ontario was a wake-up call. For a small business owner in Buffalo, New York, the prospect of a 25% jump in their electricity bill was a terrifying one. It meant potentially laying off staff or raising prices for customers who were already struggling. Trump's promise to protect American jobs felt like a cruel joke when a direct consequence of his policy was the risk of making American businesses uncompetitive. The gamble wasn't just hurting a foreign country, it was threatening the livelihoods of his own citizens. Back in Canada, the tariffs were a catalyst for change. The crisis forced the country to look inward. Prime Minister Carney began championing a One Canadian Economy Act, a plan to tear down the long-standing trade barriers between Canada's own provinces. The logic was simple. If it's going to be harder to trade with the United States, we need to make it easier to trade with each other. The conflict, while painful, was forcing Canada to fix its own internal problems and build a more resilient domestic economy. The promise was a stronger, more independent Canada. The reality for a farmer in Quebec, however, was that his products were now subject to retaliatory US tariffs, making it harder than ever to make ends meet. The standoff has cooled, but the landscape has been permanently altered. President Trump's gamble to force Canada into submission backfired. It was met with a sophisticated, multi-layered defense that not only neutralized the threat, but also sparked a powerful movement of economic self-reliance within Canada. The old, comfortable certainty of the world's most successful partnership has been replaced by a new, more cautious and strategic reality. The trust, once broken, may never be fully repaired. Both nations now stand at a historic crossroads, forced to navigate a future that is more independent, but also far more uncertain. In this new era, can the North American partners learn to win together in a different way? Or is this the beginning of a great divergence that will see them both lose by going it alone?